Welcome to. I'm going to talk about King in a bit, so you can hold me to the truth. Hi, my name's Tom Storr. Welcome to my presentation entitled "Growing Your Game: Learnings from Experimentation." I've got a clicker. I'm ready to go. So, first of all, why are we here? Over the next 30 minutes, I am going to lay out how you can get started with experimentation in your studio. So by the end of it, you should have the kind of basic fundamental principles that you need to start kind of having a go yourself. And why should you listen to these ideas? Why should you even give it any credence at all? So the idea for the Experimentation Group came at King. The company, I'm sure you guys all know, is responsible for Candy Crush and other kind of mobile puzzle games. So I joined King about 10 years ago, just after Candy Crush had launched. It was on that like massive rise. And at the time, we still were expecting it to kind of hit the peak and crash and need another game to kind of pick up the players. And so that's where Candy Soda came from. It's like, what's going to be next? Where we've got to keep hold of this kind of massive group of players that we've got, and a bunch of other games as well. So we pushed out loads of titles like Scrubby Dubby Saga, Shuffle Cats, Pepper Panic Saga, like tons and tons, which you may or may not have heard of or played. But you wouldn't be alone if you hadn't played them, because most people haven't. They didn't do very well. And so the hypothesis of the Experimentation Group was that as a company, we would do better. We would make more money if what we concentrated on was optimizing that kind of long, big portfolio of kind of like mare games rather than trying to make more games. And it worked really well. So the very first experiment that we did blew the doors off, which was really helpful. It was something called hard level labeling, which, oh yeah, here we go. This one on the left, which you probably would have been aware of. Like it's a kind of like a stand in a lot of puzzle games now. And the hypothesis behind it was that we knew, so we kind of converted a kind of single digit percentage of players into payers. And we knew that quite often that happened around a level fail. So people would get to the end of a level, be like one or two moves from finishing it, but not have any moves left, and then pay the 69p as it was at the time for 3 extra moves, I think it was. And that was a real pinch point. So some people paid, some people got annoyed and churned. And we thought, if we kind of gave permission for people to pay by saying, this is a hard level, then maybe that might kind of like solve both problems. Like people would identify with that and be like, oh, right, if this is hard and I am so close, then maybe I should just pay. And actually it really worked. Like there were double-digit increases in revenues, and we were all just like, yeah, it's party time. And any game that we put it in had a similar effect. And so the leadership team were then like, guys, when can you do this again? How often can you do this? But the really interesting thing about it was that it didn't work in the way that we expected. So if the effect we expected had been true, the peak in monetization would have been on the hard levels only, right? But actually what happened is that the monetization increases were across all levels. And so that was a kind of, although the success, like the metric success of the experiment gave us permission to do more, the kind of kernel of knowledge that we picked up from that was that actually goals are really important in games. And where previously we had this like the saga, the long kind of string of levels all in a row with no real, it was super abstract, basically. There was no kind of differentiation massively between level 10 and level 410. And by putting these points along the way that were like, this bit's a bit more interesting, it kind of encouraged some people to spend to accelerate their progress to get to that level because they were excited about it. And so actually that piece of knowledge then got recycled into like tons of other experiments and things which really worked, like piggy bank, was really good. Episode race at the end is like a competition thing, kind of allows you to gauge yourself against other players. So yeah, that worked really well. That was a long time ago, and since then, David, who was the brains behind the Experimentation Group, it was his idea. He led it, and was the VP of experimentation by the end. So he left a few years ago. Me at the end there, I've left also, and we're kind of the bread in the Phil sandwich. So in the middle, that's Phil Black, who you may have heard on the Deconstructor of Fun podcast. So he's a game economist, a massive science geek, and he was always really interested in what we were doing in the Experimentation Group. And basically, like as a trio, October last year, we decided to see like what would happen if we tried to take everything that we've learned and kind of like share it with the gaming community. And so that's what we're doing here. And what I'm going to talk about over the next kind of 24 minutes now is the kind of like distilled learnings that we've picked up at King and from all the clients that we've worked with so far. So yeah, I hope it's interesting and useful. So here we go. The juice. We're going to go through 3 main chunks. Number 1 is to operate within a structure. Number 2, balance data creativity. Number 3, move fast. You can all read. Most of the slides don't have words because they're unnecessary, I think. So in terms of operating within a structure, we've probably all seen this meme, right? Like from the outside, the kind of journey from idea to success can look like a straight line and can be like, oh, wow. Congratulations to you for, capitalizing on your genius. However, we all know, I hope that we all know that it's on the inside, it's often much more complicated than that. But the thing I want to the reason why I want to bring this up here is because now I wish I had that microphone so I could walk around, is that each pivot along that journey is deliberate. Like experimentation is not a random thing where you just throw out like, I wonder if this will work, I wonder if that will work, and never learn from what you're doing at each point to get from the bottom left-hand corner to the first time that line goes right is an idea, is your best idea. This is how I think I'm going to make a game which is going to really work. And then you push it out there and you see what happens. And almost inevitably at some point you have to change the plan. And so the point for this first kind of principle is that it's fine to try things, but it has to be in a structured way, in a deliberate way, to kind of think, I think this is going to work, and therefore I'm going to test it as quickly as possible. And once you get that learning to understand, did it work, yes or no, what's the kind of detail beneath that, that's when often you find that you have to make a pivot. So with that in mind, yes, there's 2 kind of sub-points to this. There's number 1 is being really clear about the metric that you're trying to move in the experiment that you're doing. And number 2 is always to test your strongest hypothesis. So to start with metrics, be really careful with what you're doing. We are working currently with this one amazing guy, so smart, so ambitious, but it's quite fresh to gaming. And mainly, I actually did this slide before I wrote the words, and so this is not to compare this guy with Donald Trump, but he's got big ambition and he wants to make a lot of money effectively, which I thought that would be funny to illustrate that. But in itself, just saying I want to make a lot of money is not a precise enough goal metric. And even if you were to kind of go a step beneath and say the way I'm going to make a lot of money is by selling some stuff in my store, the metric you would track in that sense is the sales of the thing in the store. But even that is not really, I don't know. I think it's worth going deeper. But the point is to consider the full implications of the metric you pick. So we had a discussion with him about using ARPU, average revenue per user, and he was like, cool, let's do that then, because if all our, if we're increasing the revenue per all our users, then we're winning, right? Like, that's amazing. However, one implication of that or one kind of solution to that might be that you aggressively put ads into your game, which amazing, everybody's monetized now, but also we know that ads are not always that popular. And so you might find at the same time that you succeed in your goal of increasing ARPU, but you trash retention, and therefore overall you're trashing your game. So it's not necessarily to say that ARPU is or isn't the right metric to choose. It's more like when you're thinking, particularly if it's some of the teams we work with are super small, like 2 people. And so you can kind of like easily manage the impact of the decisions that you make. But if you're kind of picking a metric and passing it on to a team, then just be careful about the way your decision might be interpreted and the effects it might have is one thing. And what we found actually with almost everybody that we work with is that retention's been an amazing place to start. I don't know whether it's a coincidence yet, because we've worked with about 20 studios so far, so it's still quite a small base size. But I guess the use case is always the same. It's always, we've got this game and we've had it for a few years and we've tried loads of stuff and we can't make it do what we want it to do. Can you help us with this? And almost universally, one of the big issues has been retention, like D1 to D3 in like the 20s sometimes, or 30s, like really low. And so we have found that that's generally like a really good place to start for a number of reasons. So number one, it can have immediate effects in the game. So it can help you with UA a lot. If you're keeping more players in the game, if you're able, then you're more likely to kind of increase the revenue overall, and therefore you can afford to spend more in UA. So it's kind of got a quick kind of like scaling effect to the game potentially. And secondly, the learnings that you make from that can sometimes trickle down into the later game. Like if you list D1 to D3, then obviously D4 and D5 are going to be higher, but maybe the learnings that you take from there, you could apply to like D7, D30. So there's some metric effects which are going to go beyond the choice, but also there's some kind of practical effects because number one, fast results, right? Like right at the top of the funnel is where the most people are going to see your game, your experiment the fastest, which means that you can get the result the quickest, which is very good. And also it's relatively low risk, like people that have just stepped into your game, this is their day one, day two, like if you stuff up and you make a big mess of it, then it's not the end of the world. It's not like if you're experimenting with your, you know, big payers or someone that's been in the game for like 6 months or a year, like that's, you have to be super careful there. But with like early life people, then that's a little bit safer. So that's one thing to think about. The next thing is to be clear about what your strongest hypothesis is. So actually, I thought before we start talking about this, what is a hypothesis? Like maybe just so we're all kind of on the same page about exactly what we're talking about, the language that we're using. So it's really simple. It's just a way to state an idea that you want to test and the effect that you think it might have. So if I was to start speaking in Tagalog now, if I was to start speaking it, then I would expect many people to leave the room over time. It's not a known thing. I don't know that that's going to happen, but I strongly suspect based on the kind of knowledge that I've got. And so why is it important to use one? Basically, like Winnie the Pooh here, it's important to be honest with ourselves when we're doing stuff like this. It can be very tempting to kind of play to your own ego and want to be right effectively when you do an experiment. You've got this big idea, oh, I'm going to do this thing, it's going to be amazing, and you put it out in the world and it doesn't happen as you expect. You don't want to kind of try to kind of paper out, like push it under the carpet and pretend, oh, you knew that was going to happen, because that's, you're not going to learn that way. And so the point of experimentation is that you have to view the data that comes back in the context of your expectations. If I start speaking in Tagalog and I expect you all to leave, but actually you will stay here, I've learned something there, I think, or at least there's an inkling of like the expectation that I had is not true. Like maybe actually there are some Tagalog speakers in here and maybe there's a way that we can connect there. And I guess, so the point is that by being honest about what I expected to happen and why, and then what did happen, it's allowed me to update my kind of understanding of my player base. And so from there, we can kind of build a stronger relationship. So then, why pick your strongest hypothesis? Why not pick the easiest one, the fastest one, the least risky, which are all quite tempting things to do, particularly if you've never done something like this before. The reason is there's a bunch of different benefits. So number one, if you're right and your strongest hypothesis is true, you will find out really quickly. Like players will respond really strongly and you'll see the uptick in the metrics and you think, yes, amazing. And number two, then you can continue your direct journey to success. Genius, amazing. And on the flip side, maybe counterintuitively, if you're wrong, that is actually amazing. And this could be like a really difficult thing to process sometimes. If you test your biggest idea and the experiment comes back flat or even negative, like, oh, what a waste of time, that was rubbish. Actually, it's really, really useful and valuable because you've moved a massive obstacle out of the way. If you think something is true and it's not true, if you keep trying to attack that thing, use that bit of knowledge which you think is true to grow your game and it's not true, you're never going to grow it. You're going to get stuck there. And I think that's what happens with a lot of the people that we work with is they have this kind of expectations or bunch of ideas in their brain which actually aren't true about their player base. And so being able to go out there and test the big ideas first allows you to kind of move them out of the way and move on as a team. It's like, okay, well, maybe thing A isn't true, but maybe let's try thing B then. So yes, I would always suggest to do that. Yeah, and then the point with that is that each time you get a result back, regardless of how it sits in kind of reference to your hypothesis, you will have learned something and you will have taken a step forward. And maybe the step is not in the direction that you expected, but it's still a step forward. It's still a step closer to that top right corner. So second principle is to maintain a healthy tension between data and creativity. And this was a constant battle at King. You had a kind of King's super data kind of oriented organization, and you've got business performance managers who are kind of like product manager / data people, very kind of like business oriented, as the name suggests. You've got data scientists on every team, kind of poring over the numbers, trying to understand what's going on. And for them, their preference is often to be quite entrenched in the numbers because it's a known thing, it's predictable, it's good for being able to report up and say, we're going to put this in because it's going to have this effect. And then you put it in and it has a similar effect and, you know, you look good and maybe you get promoted and everybody's happy. On the flip side, you can have game designers or more kind of creatively minded people that want to do something new and fresh and put themselves into a game because gaming is a creative industry, right? Like we want to have a part of ourselves. We don't want to just be copying all the time. We want to have a part of ourselves in the thing that we work on. And so that was a constant back and forth. And I would say most often from my experience, the data side one, which you can kind of is manifest a little in the anecdote, which I told at the top of the presentation about the kind of long track record of like mediocre games that were released alongside Candy Crush. It's like we had this super heavy green light process, which seemed to change every few months. And it just resulted in like months of work in these massive decks, you know, come and present to the leadership team and tell us what your big idea is and we'll tell you whether you can make it or not. And often it was like super basic data, like here's an IP and here's a demographic and they're underserved and they're going to go together really well and blah, 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 blah. And it just didn't work, like bluntly. Like you can look at the data over time to see that was not a great approach. Because focusing too much on data leads to incrementally decreasing returns because you're looking inwardly only, right? You're only iterating on a known thing, on a done thing. And if what you're looking for, as is often the case with experimentation, is a kind of more of a hockey stick effect, by just doing the same thing again, you're never going to get there. It's just not going to work. And And on the flip side, if you're being too way out there, too creative, and not kind of like basing your thinking and your work in data, then that's unlikely to work as well, because it's not based on the truth. It's not based on your players. It's based on a kind of maybe like a happy thought or something that you personally have enjoyed. Creativity needs to live within the frame of player behavior to be effective. New features need to leverage the things which players really care about, or else they're not going to hit. And kind of, so I guess the balance of this is that players need to be empowered to think, not players, teams need to be empowered to think super broadly and take inspiration from other games, other apps, the outside world, academia, YouTube, I don't know, whatever, like just to kind of take a bunch of ideas and integrate them into their kind of like thought process. But the ideas need to be couched in a solid understanding of the player base if they're going to be effective. And actually, it's quite easy to do that, thankfully. You just add a kind of extra bit to your hypothesis, where it's, if I did the rest of the presentation in Tagalog, then most of you would leave, because we're in Brighton and it's just not a commonly spoken language in Brighton. And so you can hopefully see from that slightly mangled example where what you're doing is iterating each time on a known. Take a piece of knowledge and you test it, you come back, you find the answer, and then you build your next hypothesis often on that piece of knowledge. And so over time, by testing, learning, you get smarter and smarter, and you kind of increment towards a positive result. Cool. So the final principle is to move fast. And actually, this is not, I wasn't expecting this to happen at all, but I think this has been the biggest differentiator between the teams that we've worked with, where it's kind of led to something positive, and one where it's kind of fizzled out into nothing. And the example of this is that when we were about to launch a couple of weeks, we'd done it super quickly. So we decided like the end of September, let's test this thing and see if it works. And then we launched, I think, October the 20-something. So it's like 2-3 weeks. And then the week before, a couple of days before, we suddenly panicked, like this kid at his party. We were like, oh my God, no one's going to come. And so we were like, what if we'd have this big launch thing and nobody pays any attention? We better come up with some case studies. We were worried that, why would anybody listen to us, right? We're just a bunch of words and a bunch of photos and just saying, oh, we know what we're talking about. Why would anyone care? And so we thought, let's do some free work. We'll get some case studies, and then we've got something to kind of build on. And in a way, it really worked, because like we got a bunch of inbounds really quickly. Like the very first day, end of first day, I think we'd had like 10 people get in touch, which was a relief. In another way, it didn't work at all, as you can see from these disappointing results. So this was actually, I think, the first client that got in touch, and we went with, the core principles. We wanted to test something which really mattered in the game. We wanted to do something real quick and easy, get something out real fast. Unfortunately, what then happened is that it became more complicated than we expected. And one learning which we picked up, which I wasn't expecting at all, I don't think any of us were, is that doing the work for free, it kind of meant that it didn't really matter to the clients that we were working with. And so quite often when you hit like a difficulty, it would just disappear down the backlog, because or something else would come up, and nothing would happen for weeks. And then because we had more interest than we were expecting, we weren't as proactive as we maybe could have been with them. And so as a result, the thing just festered for weeks and for months. And actually it took us 3 months to get to this. And then when it came back, we all just kind of looked at each other and was just like, okay. And it's really difficult, because we can explain like, well, this actually is quite interesting, but it just kind of took the momentum out of the whole thing and completely killed it. Because the reality is, although Experimentation Group at King was really lucky in that the first experiment that they did was like so successful, that's quite unusual. Like most of the time, you don't get a massive result. And so if you have spent 3 months to get to something which is flat, or quite often also it can be confusing, like you think, maybe it's flat at the top line, but then you look beneath it and there's some things you hadn't expected to be there, and it's trying to work out, like, what does this mean? Do we need to do it again? It can feel like a huge waste of time. And particularly if you're in a bigger team, and this was a bigger team, then they've got, people that are watching from the outside, is this going to work? And it doesn't work, and they have to report to their managers and be like, we tried it and it failed. And they're like, oh, well, why don't you do something else then? Like, definitely that's killed a few things. So this is the same guy. Therefore, the recommendation is to get your first experiment out in 2 weeks or less, and to do all the things we've spoken about. Take your strongest hypothesis, but test it real fast, as fast as you can, because the point is that the quicker you learn, the quicker you progress. And if you test your strongest hypothesis and it comes back at that kind of flat result, then it, as a team, like, naturally it feels less draining. It's easier to get over the kind of like, we were expecting, we were excited about this and it came back with like not underwhelming results. It's easier to get over that and to move on to the next thing, because by testing and learning consistently as a team, you can feel the knowledge building. And actually we've seen it a whole bunch of times where teams get really excited, and the data, what happens is the data comes back and it kind of democratizes the discussion. And so it can come from maybe people that have been in the business for a longer period of time, and they've got all this kind of like stored knowledge in their brain. And so often the decisions or the discussion and the ideas come more from them, and other people in the team are a bit more kind of less able to get involved because they don't have that natural advantage, maybe they're kind of more introverted and don't kind of contribute to discussions in the same way. By having this central bit of data that everybody's worked on and everybody can have an opinion on, can create more of a kind of communal and positive discussion that brings the whole team in and makes a real step change. Like, it's good fun. It genuinely is good fun. Although, I don't know, maybe that's just me. And I enjoy it. And that's it. So yeah, the 3 key principles: operate within structure, balance data and creativity, move fast. Mainly just give it a go. If you're interested and you think it might be for you, like, the main thing is to get your hands on and give it a go. If you've got any questions, we have got 15 minutes now, finished on time. And I'm about today and tomorrow, or you can email tom@experimentation.group, or I cleverly put a QR code on there to maybe my LinkedIn page, or it might be the Experimentation Group LinkedIn page, but like something anyway. So yeah, that's it. Thank you. Any questions? Do I have to pick? I think just you pick.
You mentioned test the strongest hypothesis first.
Yep.
How do you balance between the one you're most confident in and the one you think that will have the most impact?
I would go for most impact, definitely, because if it does have the most impact, then you'll see it the most quickly.
Hello.
Hello.
What would you say to coach a team that's struggling to think in a hypothesis first way? They're focusing on what competitors are doing or what they want to do first, and then trying to pull a hypothesis out of that. Do you think that's a fine way of working, or would you try and encourage people to go hypothesis first?
So I think
did that make sense?
Yes, it did make sense. I'm just trying to think. So I think the really interesting thing so I've always worked in an office, and I've only started doing like consulting in this way last October. And what has been really interesting is kind of you just kind of get like boosted into the center of these businesses, and you get to like, it's almost like being dropped in the middle of like a house, like a family house at dinner time in a midweek, and you just see all this stuff happening all around you, and they're so different. Each business is so different, and quite often there are just, you see things which are just like, wow, what is going on here? The way that we normally do it is just have discussions, basically. So we try and leave teams as much as possible to kind of do things the way they do them. But I guess the two stages that we have is have a really kind of open discussion at the beginning of the process, try and work with the kind of like maybe the game lead or the VP of gaming or something, like the top level people, because the kind of like the permission to do stuff like this has to come from the top. Like the teams need to feel able to be creative and try things that might fail. They need to, because it might fail, and they need to be able to know that they can do that and it won't hurt their career. It's quite a kind of, can be quite a difficult choice. And so one thing we've got which is really helpful is David. You know, David is just a very kind of charismatic guy who is thinks very broadly and is able to kind of challenge people in a very constructive way. And so I think one thing that I've learned from him is to kind of challenge via questions. What do you think? Why do you think that? And to kind of like turn people's assumptions or get them to kind of challenge their own assumptions effectively and think through logically, like, is this the right thing? Yes or no? And the other thing is for us to kind of present like a backlog almost of different things and then work through it together. So here's your ideas, here are some other ideas that we've come up with, and then as a group, let's kind of like go through them until we align on what we think is the most important thing. And always it has to be the team's decision, because they have to feel ownership over it. You can never kind of like force somebody to do something, because they'll just reject. If it doesn't come back positively, they'll just reject the result. But I think it's about being open and kind of constructively challenging, I guess. Is that helpful?
That is, thank you.
Cool.
Hi, first of all, very interesting presentation. I'm actually from academia, so I'm a lecturer in marketing and consumer psychology.
Cool.
You're actually using something which is very similar for what we are doing with our research. For example, we develop a hypothesis, and then we're using different type of the methods, could be qualitative or quantitative, to test whether this hypothesis is supported or not. But what we normally do is we are develop this sort of hypothesis or assumption based on theory or based on existing data or existing studies.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, actually, in the industry, or in particular with the video game industry, everything changed very quick, and with a high level of the creativities, how did you actually build this hypothesis or assumptions? Because we all know, like, testing something is actually cost a lot, time or energies or monies, so whatever. So we do want to make sure the hypotheses developed are in the very rational ways,
Yeah.
and potentially being supported. So I guess my question is, the development process is based on the experience, or you learn from the players, in our way consumers or competitors, or just experienced? Like, what could be this rationale behind this hypothesis development?
I think it's a mix of all of the above, basically. Like something we tried to do in the original experimentation group at King was to kind of like build a funnel effectively of ideas. And I think one of the interesting things that happened actually was that as traction grew with it, momentum grew, and more people got excited about it within the business, you would naturally get more ideas coming in, because there was like an open forum on the Kingfluence, it was called, like the King Confluence. where anybody could put an idea in, but quite often the ideas were either we tested them before or we'd tested something which confounded them. And so I think it's a kind of, I would say it's definitely worth being super open in terms of where you take your inspiration from. Like, we tested a whole bunch of academic theories and quite often they just didn't work. And maybe that was the way that we tested them, or maybe like quite often theories that make a big splash are then not reproducible later on, aren't they? Or maybe it's just the audience that we were testing it with. But like, yes, I feel like I'm rambling now, but like, be really open in terms of their funnel, but then be quite discriminatory, I guess, in terms of, you know, does this actually make sense versus the data we've already got? And one thing we try to do ultimately, like to kind of, I had that slide on adding the third part to your hypothesis, if A, then B, because C. We added that bit because to try and solve that problem of people just being like, oh my God, I saw this thing on TV, it was amazing, you've got to test it. Like, having that part of the form, you couldn't submit it without saying why you think it's going to work, what's the data point from. Then that was really helpful in terms of getting people to think more in more depth about why they think something's going to work.
Yeah, I mean, that's brilliant answers for that. Just want to add one point. Normally what we're also saying, which is if A, then B because of C under the context of D. Add a little bit to the story.
All right.
Thank you.
I'll take that. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for your talk. That was awesome.
Thank you.
This might just be me, but I found it marginally easier over time to get buy-in and sort of trust in this overall approach, like this data kind of thinking approach. But given that you're consulting and you're coming in from outside to an established team, like, do you have a game plan for like just trust in you guys? Like, maybe the data side of things is like the motivation's already there, but specifically working with like people coming in from outside, do you think about that much, or is there a game plan for that?
We don't have a game plan for very much, if I'm honest. Kind of make it up as we go along, which is a nice thing about working in such a small team. But I think quite often it's quite self-selecting. And so most of the people that get in touch want to do it anyway. So it's quite straightforward. I definitely, when we had that initial influx of interest, when we were talking about doing stuff for free, there are a few teams that got in touch and then they went to speak to their kind of the team that would actually be doing the work. And there was a bit of like, no thanks. I think interestingly, actually, when we first started, my hypothesis was that it was the bigger companies where this was going to work because that's where they had the budget to spend and stuff like this. And they would probably, it would be like a mirror for King effectively. They would probably have some game where they would want to experiment on. But actually what's happened there, I think, is that there's a lot more, they already have people doing all this stuff. And it's a lot more politically sensitive to be like, oh, we're going to pay these guys to come in and tell you what to do. Like, people don't want that at all. And so we've had like almost zero success with the bigger companies. And actually it's the real small ones. And sometimes surprisingly, like I say, this one guy is like literally a guy on his own, but somehow he's got money to spend and there's just a big gap where he just doesn't have that knowledge. And so he welcomes it and it's fine. So yeah, but I understand completely. Like, it can be like politically sensitive for sure.
Thanks for your answer.
All right, thank you.
Hi. Do you find that a lot of the companies, when you're brought in, have already got all of the metrics and everything in place, or is it something you have to go and put in order to be able to start like testing your hypotheses?
I'd say it is kind of, I guess, a couple of parts that answer. Like, one, I'd say it's a mix. So like some of the companies we work with have got like zero, and so we're literally building it from scratch. And at the other end of the scale, we've just started working with a company who have got everything, but they look at everything in just like insane detail. And so it's almost like pulling them out and looking at the big picture again. So yeah, answer one is that it's a big mix. And answer two is a kind of like, I guess, a sub point to the second thing is like often it just feels like people are looking in the wrong places or not looking, I'd say, at the right data. But like I was saying earlier on, like sometimes you walk into a team and you're just like, whoa, what is going on? Like quite often that's the case. We're just like, wow, I can see why you're doing that, but I can also see why you're stuck. And so, yeah, we're all quite seasoned, I guess is the polite way to put it, but like we've been about a bit, and so you can kind of be quite flexible with the context you find yourself in and kind of like try and nudge it into the place where you think it should be. All right, well, thank you very much.